see if this is all working as advertised. Where's my... Okay. Let's go into presenter view. Let's see if that... Oh, excellent. Okay, I'd like to thank the organizers very much for inviting me, and I enjoy hearing about this stuff, but I have to make a full disclosure. As I say here, I've benefited from computational chemistry over the years, many a time. I've been interested in it for my entire career. I started in the drug industry in 1989, and I have occasionally been annoyed by it, of course, and some of its practitioners, but I'm sure you guys have been annoyed by some of its practitioners too, so we're in the same boat. But I'm a customer, not a practitioner myself. So that's actually, I think, why I'm here giving this keynote, is as someone who is not up to their clavicles in this field and looks at it a bit from the outside and looks at it as a what can it do for me aspect. So we will get to that. Now, structural biology, to me, as a customer, is intimately entwined with computational chemistry. And the fields have grown together over the years because, as I mentioned here, the modelers depend on the huge reservoir of experimental data, and the experimentalists like to have good modeling tools to start fitting new data and new proteins to. So this has worked out extremely fruitfully, but you have to say, to be fair, that structural biology has advanced more or less steadily over the years, where computational chemistry and computational methods in drug discovery have lurched around a bit. There have been a lot of cycles of hope and disillusionment. When I started in '89 at Schering-Plough, that no longer exists, Schering-Plough had just put a new room in full of Evans and Sutherland workstations, the sort of thing you can only find in a computational museum these days. And they had a sign over it that said CAD. And no one knew what that acronym was, for the most part. Computer-assisted drug discovery. So the medicinal chemists across the hall felt the pressure and put a sign over their lab that said BAD, brain-assisted drug discovery. And that's where the tension was at the time. But this was even before that. This is a famous article from Fortune magazine. 1981 is when that appeared. We still can't quite do what that headline is talking about from 1981. Not quite. We're getting so close, but not quite. And this is that cycle of hype and disillusionment that many of you know so well. This is the hype part. Now, structural biology, for its part, has gone through its cycles of hype, but the most recent thing is not quite hype, AlphaFold. My own view is that it's a major achievement. It really does open up a lot of interesting paths, but I've had a lot of journalists call me and say, okay, is the revolution here? And my answer to them is no, not really, because most of our key problems do not depend on knowing the protein structure. And many of them find that extremely puzzling and disillusioning. So they go on to ask me the next question, so, what's the next AlphaFold? And then I disappoint them and disillusion them even more, because I have to tell them I don't know, and worse, I am not sure if we're going to have a next AlphaFold per se very quickly, because you need extremely high quality piles of data, very well curated data, to get something like an AlphaFold situation to work. And I don't know where you find those for some of the problems we want to do. For example, a natural progression would be some sort of pattern matching machine learning approach to ligand binding. But I think that's an even larger problem than protein folding, because I think there are more motifs in ligand binding, in small molecule ligand binding, than there are in protein interactions, as numerous as those are. So I don't think we have enough data, because if you go to the PDB, which gave us AlphaFold, after a little bit of work, if you go to the PDB, there's only about 10% of it that has ligand-bound structures in it. So I think we have a smaller data set for a larger problem. So I'm not holding my breath on that one. Now, sources of data, if you're going to do this sort of approach, you have several levels of it. The best is a great, big, huge, clean set of your own data. You generated it, you know about it, you cleaned it up, and you presumably have a lot of beautiful negative results to feed into the hopper as well. Second best would be outside data that's at least in common format, has been well curated, decently reliable. That's where I'd put the PDB. The PDB has some oddities in it, but not too many, and those have been gradually getting ironed flat over the years. Overall, it's a pretty damn good pile of data, and we don't have too many of that quality. Then you have the stuff that might be all yours, but it's kind of hard to work with. Think of cellular assay data or pharmacokinetics. They're in all sorts of formats. They're run by all sorts of people at different times. The assays vary from each other in lots of subtle and maybe not so subtle ways. That's going to be very hard to work with. And then at the very bottom, other people's data, all sorts of formats, and extremely unreliable, and that's PubMed. Now, I was in a room in the next building over several years ago, and I got to Novartis, and we had the IBM Watson people here. And that's when they were still flogging Watson for drug discovery before that disappeared, and they pretended that never happened, as far as I can tell. But they were going on about how they were going to turn it loose on the PDB and have it come up with all these amazing correlations and insights about medicine and drug discovery. So I stuck my hand up, because at this point in my career, I'm sort of a professional pain in the rear, and I said, what are you going to do about the fact that at least a third of PubMed is garbage? And you said, oh yes, we're aware of that. I said, that's not the question I asked. I didn't ask if you're aware of it. I asked what you're going to do about it, and I did not get an answer to that question. So AlphaFold, to me, it is John Searle's Chinese room. And many of you know about this. If you haven't encountered it, brace yourself, because you can spend a long time thinking about it. There's vast amounts of argumentation about it. Some people think it's a beautiful metaphor that explains a lot. Other people think it's pretty much a waste of time. Make your own call. Searle proposed that if he were sealed up in a room with an extremely detailed set of rule books for dealing with written Chinese characters, that you could feed him questions in Chinese. He would go to the thousands of rule books and look things up and come up with a reasonable answer in Mandarin Chinese and send it back out the door. In other words, he could sit there and fool someone on the other side into thinking that he was a Chinese-speaking human, when in fact he knows no Chinese at all. He's just looking things up in a rule book. That is AlphaFold to me. It embeds none of the reasons that lie behind protein structure. If the protein folding problem, the protein structure problem, if that was put on this earth by God to force the human race to learn about thermodynamics of binding, about stereoelectronics, about torsional angles and pi stacking and halogen bonding and all the rest of it, then we cheated on the exam. We dodged the question by doing pattern matching and getting to the right answer without attaining that sort of understanding. If you told me back in '89 that we had the kind of results that we get from something like AlphaFold, I would have assumed that we know a lot more about this than we actually do. But it turns out there's a shortcut. So is this where the kinds of work that you guys do, the FEP and the like, is this where these come in? Is this where we start to get more of this understanding? Now, I mentioned the problems of a medicinal chemist and what we care about and what we expect from these things. So let me talk about some of those problems. There are some immediate ones, the ones right in front of our faces. Where should we even start on this project? What's a starting compound? Should we screen for it? How should we get it? Okay, we've got some leads. What should I make next in order to advance this thing? What's the next most powerful SAR compound that I can make that answers the most questions at once? How should I make these damn compounds anyway? These are the things that we spend most of our time doing, we as medicinal chemists. Now, I may have turned into more of a chemical biologist over the years, but I still have medchem bones. These are the things we spend our time thinking about. Well, once you get past those, you have some bigger questions. How potent, how selective do the compounds even need to be on this project? How far do we have to push it? How do we balance the things that we're doing to make them more potent and selective with the worries about ADME, PK in general, tox, et cetera, formulations. And as far as all those tox and counter screens, which ones do we have to pay attention to? Which ones should we be running and which ones maybe look appealing but won't tell us enough? These are very hard questions to answer, and every project has to grapple with them. There's an even harder, bigger question waiting for you once you lift your head up from those. Should I even be working on this project at all? Should I be on this target at all? Should I even be in this therapeutic area? Should the company be on this project or this therapeutic area? Now, that's a stumper. These things get progressively more impossible for computational methods to help you out in the tiniest bit. I think those earlier ones up there are where our computational techniques really have a chance of helping us. And that's the sort of thing we've been seeing so far today. As you get out to these, I don't know where you get help. This is kind of the central problem of the drug industry. Here's the central problem of the drug industry, and I've highlighted it right there. That is the overall success rate of projects as they go into the clinic. Now, think of all the ones that fail before they get to clinic. I've spent most of my career working on those. But once you get to the clinic, 86% of all projects fail. And they fail because of picking the wrong target. That's a big one. They fail because of unexpected tox, weird side effects that happen. That's another big one. Once in a while, they fail for sheer commercial reasons, like, oh crap, we're getting blown out of this market, let's drop this. But those first two are the major reasons behind it. To me, this is the central fact of the drug industry. Everything that's weird about our industry, everything that people hate about the drug industry is embodied in that. 86% of Boeing's aircraft designs can probably leave the ground. 86% of Pizza Hut's pizzas are as edible as they're ever going to be. But 86% of our hard-won clinical trials fail. There's no other industry that works like this, and this is why it is such a weird thing to do for a living. Now, given these problems, just given those medchem problems, let's go back to something we can actually attain. What is it that medicinal chemists want? Well, those are those things I was talking about. Where do I even start? What compounds should I make next? We, customers, medicinal chemists, would like to see yet more improvements in just the sort of things you'd imagine. Virtual screening, docking and scoring, ideas about what the next thing should be that we don't have to think up ourselves. These can come from our own mighty brains, of course, but it's fine if they come from computational hypotheses or from generative chemistry. In the end, we don't care. I do have some acquaintances in the industry who feel threatened by this sort of thing, but I am not one of them, and I don't think any of us should be. There is more to work on. There are more things to do than we possibly have time to do them. I mean, every drug project can go on more or less forever if you just keep the chemists working on it. We almost never run out of ideas. There's another thing to try all the time. The big problem managing this sort of thing is knowing when to say, oh, enough, get this out of here. Let's take it to the clinic. But if you don't say that, we'll go on as long as you want. Keep spending money and making compounds. So we need to find a way out of that because that's obviously not a way to run a business. So help us out in narrowing down our ridiculous number of choices. Now, so I'm not going to make you guys solve those bigger problems. This is where the rubber meets the road as far as a medicinal chemist is. We are simple folk and we have simple needs. But as we get better tools, we're starting to hear the AI and ML hoofbeats coming up behind us. You know, times fuel-injected turbocharged chariot ever hurrying near, if you know the Andrew Marvell poem. As the machines get better, we chemists are going to have to learn to concentrate on the tasks that the machines can't do. There are a lot of jobs, not just in the labs, there are a lot of jobs out there right now that machines do that we no longer consider fit for human beings to be doing. Washing your laundry on a flat rock down by the river, for example. An elevator operator. They used to have those back in the early 1900s, someone who actually ran the elevator and made it stop on the right floor. Rotovapes, sample changers, fraction collectors. Those are the sorts of things in the labs that I work in that used to be human jobs. When I was in grad school, I was the fraction collector. We didn't have money for fraction collectors. I sat there moving test tubes and Erlenmeyers. In some labs around the world, that's still the case. The fraction collector has a first and last name and takes a lunch break. But we gradually see these things as no longer fit for human beings to do, and that category is continually expanding. Doing things that machines can't do for you is actually going to be, already is, a condition of employment. And we may end up with fewer drug discovery scientists, fewer chemists. We might end up with more. We might end up with the same. I have no idea, but what I'm absolutely sure of is that all of them will be gradually moving upwards into higher order problems, because the lower order stuff is going to be gradually more and more competently handled by automation and by software. That trend is going to continue. Now, role of computation in general, I think that the large language model stuff, the machine learning, are only going to get us so far because there's a conservation law at work here. These things do not create knowledge. They rearrange knowledge you already had. And that can be very nice. It can be very useful. You can put it into terms that you can deal with a lot better. You can find correlations you didn't know were there, or even have it stated to you in a way that suddenly you grasp what's going on or can explain it to others. These are all great, but you're not creating knowledge. Creation of knowledge comes from structural biology, from chemistry, chemical biology, and I hope from computation. This is where we break out of that Malthusian sort of cycle of rearranging the things we already have and trying to squeeze as much as we can out of them. We need new knowledge. God knows we need a lot more knowledge than we have now about what we're doing. That's where that 86% failure rate comes in. So as we get more of these tools, more people, of course, are using them. It became easier for people to do molecular biology. It became easier then for people to do chemical biology, and now it's probably getting easier for people to do structural biology as well, and easier to do, over time, some of these high-end computational methods that you folks are talking about. That's not always good. At a previous company, they rolled out a bunch of computational methods to the bench chemists, and we misused them brutally, foully. Some of us ended up calling them the silent killers because it killed off ideas too quickly, because people say, oh, I modeled that, it didn't work, without realizing just what the error bars were on these techniques. And think of how big the error bars were for the techniques that they saw fit to give to the medicinal chemists. Right. So on the positive side, Freeman Dyson is famous for saying that new directions in science are launched more often by new tools, and we have a lot of new tools coming on. So that's an optimist point of view. On the pessimist side, these lower barriers to entry mean it's going to be a lot easier to crank out really mediocre, boring work. And you may have seen some of that here and there, now and then, at the occasional conference. There's going to be a lot more of it. We also run an even greater risk, getting seduced by detail. Now that sounds a little weird, so I want to tell you what I'm talking about. There is a terrifying level of detail in the biology of this business. That's where we need the new knowledge, but God knows we have a lot of knowledge already. There's more than we can handle when you start looking at these things. We have learned so much by studying all the intricate, tiny details one by one, but we have paid a price for that. Reductionism is a tool, but it's not the only tool in the box. You want some fine detail? Check that out. That is fine detail for you. If you were trying to analyze this, you could say, great, all right, I'll assign an XY axis to it. We'll figure out where these different sorts of blobs of color are going. There seem to be fewer of the pink ones up in that upper left corner and over in the upper right corner. That might be significant. Some of the vertical versus horizontal, that's a pattern as well. There's something going on here. Can't quite figure out what it is. Let me make a great big graph of all the different sorts of shades and hues and their position and see what I can learn. You can do that, but it will never, ever, ever tell you where it came from, which is that. That is one of the shady bits of one of those skirts near the middle of Le Grand Jatte, or Searle's pointillist painting. And in the same way that you cannot go from that left-hand side to the right-hand side, reductionism will not take you from this to that. You can't get there. It's more than the sum of its parts. So how do we get the most big picture data out of what we're doing? How do we try to make that jump? Well, reductionist models have been the feature of our industry forever, and of research in medicine in general. This is a quote from a paper from 2016 that it took me about 2 years to actually read through it and start to understand it. There's been a sequel to it, and I'm about halfway through that, so talk to me in a couple of years. Jack Scannell was saying, though, that there has been an exhaustion of models that are highly predictive of clinical utility. So you shift to crappier models because you have to work on something. It may be that these good reductionist models, he said, have been difficult to produce. So there's been a tendency to use the bad ones instead. And the moral hazard, the real seductive trap here, is that bad models also generate lots and lots of things you can put on PowerPoint slides and show to upper management. They're so simple, even upper management can understand them. You can have metrics on there about how many screens you ran, how many compounds you evaluated, what their properties were, and how you've improved their C-log Ps, and et cetera, and everyone will be very happy about this stuff, but it may or may not be getting you anywhere. And in fact, you may actually be starting to focus more on the things that are easier to present and the things that are easier to manage and quantify than the real problems that are hitting you. So Scannell talked a bit about predictive validity. I'm not going to go into great detail here. The paper's worth a read if it takes you less than 2 years to read it like it did me. But predictive validity is basically a high correlation between a decision variable and a reference variable. How good is your assay? How tight are these? How relevant are they? So in this case, if you look at this thing, that one on the left is a high predictive validity situation. You have a lot of true positives and you have a few false positives and a few false negatives. That's a nice place to be. On the right-hand side is more what we deal with in reality. Lower predictive validity, you still have some true positives up there in the far right-hand corner, but they are overwhelmed by the number of false negatives and false positives. Some of you may have possibly experienced a situation like this once or twice, here and there. So the true positives, if they outnumber that stuff, you're in good shape. At low predictive validity, you have to screen a lot more, but if you screen a lot more, you're going to get a lot more of these false positives and false negatives. So what are you going to do about that? Well, add that into the problem of intrinsic hit rates in our business. This is just a table of a few things where you see what kind of screening hits you get out. We all know this. Some targets hit at greater rates than others. Some things are just intrinsically more suited to the kinds of compounds we're screening against them. Some binding sites and mechanisms are just extremely harder to hit than others. Well, if you look at hit rates versus predictive validity, if you have a high predictive value and a high intrinsic hit rate, well, good for you. I have never experienced this since 1989, but if you do, I suggest you roll around and enjoy it as much as possible, because you have an embarrassment of riches, and it's just a question of picking which of these wonderful leads to work with. High predictive value, low intrinsic hit rate, well, you have very few hits, but they are mostly real, so you've got something to get your teeth into. Low predictive value with a high intrinsic hit rate, well, there's a lot to sort through, but if you work at it, you can find things. There will be a few, there will be a pony under that huge pile of manure. But low predictive value, low intrinsic hit rate, there's lots to sort through, but in vain. You can spend weeks, months, years, your career digging through this piles of stuff because you've got a lot of false negatives, which you don't see, but almost all your positives are false positives. This is where you don't want to be, but this is where we end up too much of the time. So This is another Scannell graph, predictability versus throughput. This is kind of terrifying. That PPV over there is positive predictive value, basically the proportion of decisions that give you true positive readouts. Along here is the predictive validity, along that bottom axis, and over on the other side is log throughput. Now, we're not going to go into this in detail, God knows, but I wonder if this is a laser pointer. It was at some point. There we go. What happens is if you're over here with a really good predictive validity, as you do more and more assays, you get into the very good predictive value territory very quickly. If it's not so great, you can get there if you keep screening harder. But if your predictive validity was low to start with, if your assay was not really any good, it does not matter how hard you screen. You are going to be in horrible territory no matter what. You cannot screen your way out of a crappy assay. It's what this is telling you. It's just a mathematical representation of that. So you may have experienced this yourself too. But the problem is that trying to screen your way out of a crappy assay is a constant temptation. And you can also present this on your PowerPoint slides or in your annual write-up of what you accomplished this year about how hard you screened. So there's this whole idea of the chain of translatability. There needs to be a shared mechanistic basis for the assay readout, the disease readout, and the real human biology of the disease. That is very hard to attain. That's why I keep saying we need so much more knowledge about the biology of disease. So this is basically applying that predictive validity concept to the whole screening cascade. You have to make your assay endpoints and your disease endpoints as close as possible, or you run the risk of fooling yourself, and you run the risk of adding more to that 86% pile of failures. Now, this is a problem for all of us because the hazard is getting down in the details instead of dealing with these big problems. And I think it could be a particular hazard for people in the computational field because God knows you have a lot of details to work with. And we can't get anywhere without dealing with some of them, but we're going to have to, lift our heads up every so often. Remember Einstein's famous advice that you should make a theory as simple as possible, but not any simpler? Now, it's very hard to know when you've reached that point. Well, maybe after you've gone too far into it, you find out, but it's very hard to know when you crossed over. We have focused, and I mean scientists in general, across medicine and the entire drug industry, we have focused on breaking drug discovery down into tinier and tinier pieces, simpler steps, and it made a lot of sense, heuristically, financially. To a point, it makes a lot of scientific sense. But we are dealing with systems that are more than the sum of their parts. So we have to be ready to get out of the reductionist viewpoint when needed. And it's going to be, I think, increasingly needed. Reductionism is not dead. We're going to be able to keep beating on this for quite a while. But we are going to have to get ready for something else. So consider the kinds of computational work that we're hearing about this conference. Do a thought experiment. What happens is if you imagine the world where these problems have been solved, FEP ligand design, generative chemistry, protein structures, molecular dynamics, the lot. What if we actually get to the point where these have turned into obvious, useful, everyone knows they work, tools that everyone applies all the time? Now, of course, people have been promising this since at least 1981, if not earlier, but I always tell people when they ask me about this that I am a short-term pessimist about computational work and a long-term optimist. I see no reason why these techniques shouldn't work. I see no physical or mathematical or logical reason why they shouldn't work, and no reason why we shouldn't be able to do these things. However, if someone comes into my office tomorrow and tells me they've solved it, I'm keeping my hand on my wallet. Because I don't think it's happening quite that quickly, but I think as these things do happen, and I think they will, they may happen more suddenly than many of us are ready for. The AlphaFold work in protein folding happened more suddenly than many of us were ready for. Now that, as I say, may have been a special case, but you have all seen these sort of sudden phase changes in this work. So what happens if all of these things are working? Well, now we all have to make that move to the more complicated, higher level problems that I was talking about earlier, because these lower level ones of what compound should I start with and what should I make next and how does it bind and what's the best, those are more or less trivial now. We can do them now because we have the tools. So we now have to grapple with those other things, picking the right targets, picking the right assays for them, anticipating metabolism and tox, picking the right diseases to work on and the right approach to those diseases. It's going to force us up into that world. I don't know when that's going to happen, but I think it is going to happen, and I think it's going to take us by surprise when it does. So get braced, look up and look around, and good luck. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Dirk. Questions for Dirk?
What I think is missing here is the PDB is very thin on the very macro biology, that is DNA.
Ah,
That is a big issue, I think.
yeah. Oh, yeah. I didn't even mention the oligos. The DNA, RNA worlds are extremely important, as every drug company that's decided, hey, we're going to pivot to RNA, as every one of those has discovered, the tools for dealing with these things are far, far behind the tools for dealing with proteins. I mean, if you told me, again, I go back to like when I was in grad school in the 80s, if you told me how many different kinds of RNA there turn out to be and how important they are, I wouldn't have believed you for a minute. But obviously, and think of the ones we haven't discovered yet. 25 years from now, what will people be looking at us and thinking, oh, those poor people? No wonder they weren't getting anywhere. They didn't know about X and Y and Z. So yeah, I agree with you.
I have one.
Hey,
About the
one too.
Okay. Thinking about the predictive models, I wonder if you can actually get new knowledge from them when you make them interpretable, because they're good at, recognizing patterns, but if you make them interpretable, you can actually get insights into the
Yeah.
study.
I think that comes under the heading of new to us. The knowledge was in there, but we didn't have a good way to extract it. It's the same way that if you start going through something like the machine learning patterns that the AlphaFold model came up with, you're like, okay, I didn't realize that these motifs interacted in that way and that they do it this way unless when this happens or when that happens. So I think it's a great way to uncover things that were latent in the data that we weren't able to realize. But as far as uncovering completely new things, that's got to be done experimentally. But these might as well be new because they're certainly new to us.
What would your practical advice be to someone who finds it very appealing to keep screening with these bad assays? When do you give up?
Oh boy, yeah, it's a problem. I mean, I'm on my fourth company now. I hope my last one, but I've seen people make these opposite errors. It's one of my principles that there's a ditch on both sides of the road and you can steer into either one of them. And I've been at companies where they just said, keep going, keep going, keep going. Projects went on for years and years and years. Even screens went on and on and on and on. And some of these things, of course, never delivered. And the people involved would get so frustrated that when they went on in their careers and got off to run organizations and departments themselves, they said, by golly, I'm never going to make that mistake. We are going to really snap things along here. And then they set the timelines too short and steered into the ditch on the other side of the road. And you can't get things to work like that either. So it's really hard advice because some projects, of course, because of their low intrinsic hit rate or the difficulty in setting up the assays, are going to have to take a lot longer. The only thing I can say for sure is if you try to put a one-size-fits-all metric on that, you are going to screw things up in both directions. So if you don't want to do that, you're going to have to be a little bit flexible about this and give some things more time, but like Einstein's quote, not too much time, because some of these things can go on infinitely, but where to position that slider is going to be different for every project. And if I had a great answer for that, I wouldn't be here. I'd be speaking to you from my private island.
One more quick question from anyone? All right, let's thank Derek again, all of our speakers.